It was an unusually harsh winter, the kind where the snow piled high and temperatures dropped so low that it hurt to breathe. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a boy named Marcus bundled up in his old winter coat, tugged on his worn-out gloves, and grabbed a snow shovel from the porch. The teenager had been shoveling driveways for extra cash for as long as he could remember. But there was one house he always cleared, without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Richardson was an elderly woman who lived alone in a small weathered house on the corner. She didn't get out much anymore, her frail body no longer able to handle the tough winter cold. But even though they barely spoke, Marcus always made sure her walkway was shoveled. It was something he'd started doing years ago, back when he saw her struggling with a shovel twice her size. She never asked him to, but every time he cleared her driveway, she'd watch from her window, nodding with a gentle smile. Marcus didn't think much of it. It was just a good deed, a small way to help someone who had lived through more winters than he could imagine. She'd offer him tea sometimes, but Marcus always declined, hurrying to finish up before moving on to the next house on his list. He figured he'd keep shoveling for her as long as she needed, never realizing how much the act meant to her. That year, the snow seemed endless. Day after day, Marcus found himself back at Mrs. Richardson's, pushing snow off her driveway, sometimes twice a day. As he worked, she'd appear behind the lace curtains, watching him with those soft, knowing eyes. They never said much to each other, just a wave or a nod, but it felt like enough. She was quiet, almost mysterious, but in a way that felt familiar to Marcus. He often wondered about her life, her past, and why she lived alone, but he never asked. It seemed rude to pry, and besides, he had his own problems to deal with. Then, one bitterly cold morning, everything changed. Marcus arrived at her house, shovel in hand, only to see that Mrs. Richardson's driveway remained untouched. Even though the snow had fallen heavily overnight, her curtains were drawn, and the house looked eerily still. He paused, unsure of what to do. For the first time in years, he felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. A few days later, he found out that Mrs. Richardson had passed away quietly in her sleep. The news hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had known she was old, but it still felt strange to think she was gone. There would be no more silent waves from the window, no more warm smiles as he cleared her path. The street felt emptier without her presence. Months passed, and winter melted into spring. Marcus had almost put the whole thing behind him when he received an unexpected phone call. It was from a lawyer's office, asking him to come in regarding Mrs. Richardson's estate. Confused, Marcus couldn't imagine why they would need him. He hadn't been close to her, hadn't even really known her, but curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to go. What Marcus discovered at that meeting would leave him speechless. A revelation that changed everything he thought he knew about the quiet old woman on the corner. Mrs. Richardson had left something for him in her will, something he never could have imagined. What did she leave behind? And why did she choose him? As Marcus sat in the lawyer's office, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The room smelled like old books and leather, with walls lined with framed certificates and dusty legal volumes. He fidgeted in his chair, wondering why he was even there. Mrs. Richardson had been kind, sure, but they weren't close. She'd never spoken much about herself or her family, and Marcus hadn't thought too deeply about her life beyond what he saw from the outside. A quiet, elderly woman living alone. He figured whatever this was, it had to be a mistake. The lawyer, an older man with silver hair and a serious expression, finally spoke. Mrs. Richardson included you in her will, he said, flipping through some papers. It seemed she had very specific instructions. Marcus blinked in disbelief. He had expected a simple explanation, maybe a thank you note, or a mention of his help with the snow, but a spot in her will? That didn't make sense. Why would she leave anything to him? He barely knew her beyond a few brief exchanges, and these many hours spent shoveling her driveway. The lawyer slid a small envelope across the desk toward Marcus. It was old, the edges slightly yellowed, with his name written neatly on the front in Mrs. Richardson's handwriting. "She wanted you to have this," the lawyer said. "And there's more." Marcus hesitated before picking up the envelope. The weight of it felt strange in his hands, like it carried something far heavier than a simple note. Slowly, he opened it, finding a letter inside, the handwriting delicate but clear. As he read, Mrs. Richardson's words started to piece together a life Marcus had never known. She wrote about her late husband, who had passed away many years ago. Long before Marcus had moved into the neighborhood, they had never been able to have children, and when he died, she was left alone. The loneliness had been overwhelming, but over time, she found solace in her garden and her quiet life. Yet, it was when Marcus began shoveling her driveway, without asking for anything in return, that she started to feel a new sense of connection. She saw in him the kindness she had long thought was lost in the world. The letter was heartfelt, but there was something more, a final request. Mrs. Richardson had left Marcus her house, the very home he had cleared of snow, year after year. It was an overwhelming gesture, one that Marcus couldn't quite wrap his head around. Why would she do this? Surely, there had to be someone else. Family, distant relatives, someone who deserved this more. But the lawyer assured him that Mrs. Richardson had no living heirs, and in her will, she had clearly chosen Marcus. With the house, though, came a condition. There was something hidden within its walls, something she wanted Marcus to find. She didn't specify what it was, only that it was important, and that he would understand once he found it. Her words lingered in his mind, creating a sense of mystery and anticipation that gnawed at him. What could she possibly have hidden away all these years? And why had she trusted him with it? Marcus's mind raced as he left the lawyer's office. He walked through the familiar streets, his heart heavy with questions. The old house, which he had passed so many times without a second thought, now seemed to loom larger in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Mrs. Richardson's life than anyone had known, something buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Days later, Marcus found himself standing on her doorstep, keys in hand. The house felt different now that he had the right to step inside. It wasn't just an old, empty home. It was a puzzle, one he was determined to solve. He wandered through the rooms, each one filled with the remnants of a life long lived. Old furniture, fading photographs, and delicate trinkets lined the shelves. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the woman who had left this behind. But there was also a tension in the air, as though something was just out of reach. He spent hours searching, checking every corner, every crevice. He went through drawers, lifted floorboards, and even examined the walls for hidden compartments. As the hours stretched on, his frustration grew. What was he supposed to find? Had Mrs. Richardson simply wanted him to experience the weight of her history? Or was there truly something more? Then, just as he was about to give up, Marcus noticed something strange about the wall in the back of her bedroom closet. It looked like the wood paneling didn't quite match the rest of the room. His heart raced as he pressed against it, feeling for any signs of a hidden latch or door. And then, with a soft click, the panel gave way. Behind it was a small compartment, no larger than a shoebox, and inside was an old weathered journal. Marcus's hands trembled as he picked it up. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but it was clear that this was what Mrs. Richardson had wanted him to find. Marcus sat down on the floor, the weight of the old journal heavy in his hands. He carefully turned the fragile pages, each one revealing more about Mrs. Richardson's life than he ever could have guessed. As he read through the detailed entries, the story that unfolded before him was more than just a recollection of her life. It was a confession. Years ago, before Marcus was even born, Mrs. Richardson's husband had been involved in a serious legal case, something that had haunted them, both for the rest of their lives. He had been accused of financial misconduct, a scheme that had ruined the savings of several families in the community. But the truth, hidden in these pages, was that Mrs. Richardson had taken the fall for her husband. She had helped cover up his actions to protect him, believing that his reputation and their future were worth the cost. Though they managed to avoid legal consequences, the guilt of what they'd done weighed heavily on her. She had been living with that burden in silence long after her husband's passing. As Marcus read the final entries, he realized why she had left the house, and her secret to him. She had seen in him the goodness, the integrity that her husband lacked. By leaving him the house, she wasn't just giving him a place to live. She was asking him to decide what to do with her past. The journal held the truth about what had happened all those years ago. The very people she had wronged, many of them elderly now, still lived in the community. She wanted Marcus to make things right, to do what she had never been able to do in her lifetime. The revelation hit Marcus like a wave. He had always seen Mrs. Richardson as a kind, quiet woman, but now he understood the pain she had carried. And now, that responsibility was his. He could feel the weight of her words, her guilt, and her plea for redemption. The stakes were higher than Marcus had ever imagined. He could keep the secret, protect her legacy, and let the past stay buried. But he knew, deep down, that Mrs. Richardson had chosen him for a reason. She believed in his character, in his sense of right and wrong. It wasn't just about the house or the journal. It was about making amends. Even after so much time had passed, Marcus spent the next few days thinking about what to do. He couldn't shake the feeling that the people affected by Mrs. Richardson's husband's actions deserved to know the truth, but he also didn't want to tarnish her memory. It was a difficult choice, one that weighed on him constantly. After long reflection, Marcus made his decision. In the end, he reached out to a few trusted people in the community, those who had known Mrs. Richardson and who had been directly impacted by her husband's actions. With great care, he shared the journal with them, explaining her role in the events and her desire for closure. It wasn't easy, and some were angry, others heartbroken, but most appreciated the truth, understanding that even in her mistakes, Mrs. Richardson had been trying to protect someone she loved, and now she was seeking redemption through Marcus's actions. As the weeks passed, Marcus worked with the families to help in whatever way he could, using the inheritance Mrs. Richardson had left him not just for his own benefit, but to make up for what had been lost. It wasn't about clearing her name. It was about giving people the justice and closure they deserved. In the end, the house became more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of second chances, of making things right, even when the past seemed impossible to fix. Marcus had been given the unexpected task of carrying forward Mrs. Richardson's legacy. But it was a legacy that came with both pain and hope. The story of the boy who shoveled snow for an elderly woman had turned into something far bigger than he had ever expected. Marcus had gone from helping her in small, simple ways to uncovering the truth of her past, and, in doing so, finding a way to heal the community she had left behind. As Marcus stood on the porch of Mrs. Richardson's old house, looking out at the neighborhood he had grown up in, he felt a sense of peace. The secrets had been revealed, the wrongs had been addressed, and the weight of the past had been lifted. What started as a simple act of kindness, a boy shoveling snow, had turned into a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of doing what's right, even when it's hard. And as he closed the door behind him, Marcus knew that the legacy Mrs. Richardson had left him was more than just a house. It was the lesson that, no matter how dark the past, there's always a way to find light.